Hey everybody, it's Achilles Justice here with the Philosophy Society. It's May 15th, 2024. It's a Wednesday. We're in the library at Toronto Metropolitan University. We're on the 8th floor this time, way better room, big difference. There's a pillar in front of me, but you wouldn't see. So that's a little awkward, but that's like I'm talking to concrete. It's okay, don't worry about it. So today is one of those days where I didn't sleep and I wrote an exam at 1 p.m. So we're not going to do the 7 habits today. We're going to do the philosophical practice, the theoretical discussion like I did before. Yeah, that's where we're going to go with it today. So let me just get set up here. Marker in hand. There's a difference between the marker and the slides. You know, I like the marker better, to be honest. Okay, so we got the being, right? You, which is the self. Well, there's like the representation of the self, and then there's like the being. Okay? And there's, you know, through self-awareness, we develop like an identity. Okay? Now, in Stephen Covey's book, we're talking about character. And character can sometimes be perceived as being inauthentic, which Stephen Covey does not want to look at it that way. He distinguishes between the personality ethic, which he would call that, and the character ethic. Whereas I feel that when we look at the way we use words, someone could say, appealing to Wittgenstein, so we're going to go to our, see if we can see this here. Yeah, Wizard's Tower of Philosophy. All right, in one of our windows, we got Wittgenstein. And he talks about how the meaning of words is determined through their use, right? So when we look at and the reason that's good is because it's a fluid understanding of how words develop their meaning, because certain situations or cultural contexts can change over time. There is some sort of a rigorous analytic necessary and sufficient condition for terms. Like it has to meet these criteria. Like it has to be, you know, it has to have seeds in it and have an outer layer for it to be an apple, right? If it doesn't have those things, it wouldn't really be an apple. It would be at least an apple minus those things if you cut them away, you know? So identity, and you could almost say it's synonymous with character. But I would say character is almost a projection or an ideal state that you're trying to achieve, right? And you may get good at it over time, and other people may perceive you that way, whereas identity is like more tied with your being. And character is more about like which self you're representing at that time. Because someone could like say like, you're being a character right now, you know, when we go back to the use of words. So what are our philosophical tools? Right? We're going to have meaning and the use of words. Okay. And we've derived this from Wittgenstein. He's in his tower. Boom. He has this spell book called the Philosophical Investigations. And he casts this spell. And that's his philosophical tool, right? And so when someone says that, oh, you're it's almost like you're acting a part, you know, or you're pretending to be this thing. And that is a different view of character than what we've been discussing with the Stephen Covey stuff. The Stephen Covey stuff is more in line with like, Stephen Covey would like to say it's in the category of Aristotelian virtue ethics. So in our Wizard's Tower, over here, we got Aristotle. All right. And he wrote this 2 books, one called the Eudemidian Ethics and the other, the Nicomachean Ethics. And it's a discussion of how we define what certain virtues are and how to kind of apply those virtues and the nature of developing practical wisdom in the application of these virtues. So identity is more about your being. So there's certain things that you can't really, like maybe there's like some chosen identity and non-chosen identity. So if we had a big Venn diagram of identity here, some of it you can choose, others you can't. Right? And there can be some, there's heated discussions for like the trans or gender, debate on whether like even saying assigned gender or assigned sex at birth is in some way saying that you are making a choice of what this person is. Whereas I would, ascribe to you're born with it in a certain context. There are some specific instances of individuals that may demonstrate almost both genitalia, like a hermaphrodite kind of context. But genetically, they actually have the full sexual organ of one or the other, and then the other would be underdeveloped, but usually based on the amount of testosterone or whatever that's in prenatal development. So when we're looking at this, the choice between identity, I think that's a big deal. Now, character, in some ways, is something that you're doing, right? So there may be parts of what you are, parts of your being that you don't like when you become aware of it. So if this is the present, right? And then over here is the future. And then back here is the past. There's stuff over here that you may not agree with. You're like, oh, that was bad. If I could have done it differently, I would have done this instead, or I would have taken some space, or the decision ought to have been made previously, right? Because we lose self-control, or, we were unaware of certain things. And there's two things in that. One is like you're engaging with reflection, and that's giving you the opportunity to learn. So that's super important, especially in the context of mistakes. And Stephen Covey talks about this, this is why we go through this book, right? He talks about the twofold mistakes. One of them is the actual error that you made, right? Like you're doing a calculation and you wrote down 3 instead of 8, and the whole thing's off now. That's not good. So alternatively, if you don't acknowledge that you made the error, that's a higher ordered mistake, like being arrogant and not accepting that an error was made. And so again, that's another reason why the text does have a philosophical nature to it, i.e. there's some wisdom to be gained by reading this book. So, okay, I know that Dimitri has it. Daji, have you gotten a chance to either watch the previous videos that I went through the book, or have you bought the book?
Hi, no, I didn't watch the previous videos. I was busy this week, but I did purchase the book.
You did?
Yes.
Hey, that's amazing. And you get a token for that. Daji
Thank
gets one
you.
token. Right there. One for the. Oh.
Awesome. There's nobody else on that list, though. Am I the only one who bought the book?
Before, but you earned your token today.
Awesome.
So have you gotten a chance to read through the book at all?
No.
Okay, that's fine. You got it in the pocket though, so you can pull it out. It's like a spell book, right? Like over here.
Exactly.
And once you learn the spell, you can start casting it and dealing with life. That's like, it's like a funny analogy I think about like learning. Like, I don't know if anyone's played the Elder Scrolls games. When you learn a spell, you can use it in battle or use it in gaining future experience. Learning is a lot like that, because once you compress the knowledge into you, you see the world. This is why education is so important early on in life. Because as soon as you learn the thing, now you can use that knowledge to gain an advantage over your environment or in your relationships and stuff. Not in a bad way, just in a way that you're more effective, right?
Yeah. I've actually played the Elder Scrolls game. I have a good 100 hours on them when I was like 14. So thank you for that reference. But yeah, I agree. I love how it makes philosophy very practical. Usually for most people, philosophy is just something theoretical they discuss, not something they act on. So I really appreciate that the book helps, do that. I can't wait to actually get into it. Yeah,
for sure. And so that's why we're doing the videos. Like, we're not doing one today, but I'm kind of just doing an overview. And going through a theoretical understanding of this. But it's good because now they're going to be part of the YouTube channel, and then people can refer to them. I may update them later if I feel the need, but I'll probably do another book and at least have all that stuff cataloged. And then we can, once there's more revenue coming in with the business as a economic entity, I can just do professional videos in that sense. Hello?
Oh, I didn't know you
I'm
were
just
doing
recording right now. Sorry about that.
it. All right.
I'm hiding behind the pillar.
It's okay. I'm just checking into the keyboard.
Okay, thanks, buddy.
Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. So, okay, what do we got going on here? So we have identity and character. And so character, we want to distinguish between one as like an inauthentic act, right? Which Covey talks about the personality ethic, which I have not heard anybody else use that phrase except for him. And then the other side would be like an effortful ideal state that you're approaching. You know, we'll just call it the authentic ideal, right? You're working towards being this kind of person, right? And that's where we really get the virtue ethic thing. Or stoicism. Now, stoicism has some criticisms that like maybe you're not processing emotions well, or you're being kind of a psychopath and not relating to people emotionally. But I think really the value of stoicism is to have control and temperance, not losing control of your emotions. And one of the great quotes by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, I'm going to paraphrase it, is to get angry is easy, but to get angry in the right degree to the right person at the right time with the right intensity is not easy. It's very difficult. And as human beings, there may be moments when, as long as you're in control, that displaying some anger, quote unquote, not violent or aggressive, but displaying that form of communication is actually a good thing. But it's the problem with it is that anger is often associated with people losing control. And so, you know, it's better to just err on the side of not doing it at all, right? Yeah. So, okay. So we have the being, we have the self, and now this relationship between being and self, that is a theoretical construct that I have developed. So you're not really going to find that, I don't think, anywhere except for whatever book I write in the future or papers I publish. But I think it's a very useful way to think about how we're engaging with, in this case, character, which would be just the self over time, right? It would maybe even be situationally specific kinds of selves that are relative to either virtues or how the individual is dealing with a situation specifically that, you know, but then again, we can just say there's some virtue involved there, right? Okay. So, yeah. So in the future, we're going to have this ideal self, which is character. And character is something that we're developing over time, in some ways just to be a good person, you know? Like, what's the purpose of this? Or we got character here, you know? And that's through your own reflection, but also through the feedback of others. Now, feedback as a mechanism, that takes some skill to get good at, right? And it can be contingent on situational factors and our emotional state. Also, maybe some cultural predispositions, like certain cultural groups may be more or less likely to accept feedback, and especially how the feedback is being given and the end of the feedback. So for example, there's individualistic cultures like Western societies and collectivistic cultures. And so in an individualistic culture, people are very achievement oriented. Whereas in a collectivistic culture, they're very focused on group cohesion and being part of the group and contributing to the group. So if the feedback is directed towards you're doing better for yourself, that will be more receptive in like Canada, for example, with specific, like people born in Canada that are raised in this individualistic society or culture. And someone who's like born in China or Japan, right? they're going to demonstrate more affiliation towards like their family or maybe like their nation, right? And so the feedback, you're doing really well for your family, that will be more receptive in some ways. But the feedback really is just about, I'm speaking, and I'm come from, Canada, so I am an individualistic individual, but at the same time, I do appreciate a cultural predisposition. I think that there is collectivistic orientation. I think there is something to be said about a group cohesion. Hence, I'm facilitating this group called the Philosophy Society. A lot of people, they just write their stuff and publish, and it's just, they're in a silo, right? And there's a select individuals that they'll communicate with, but they're just publishing on their own, right? Whereas I'm trying to create an organization here. I'm trying to create a social group that has specific kinds of values and practices. So that's collectivistic in some ways, like it's a group, you know what I mean? And so that's good. We want that. We can't just do it alone. I think so if we have individualistic, right here, and then right here we have collectivistic, right? Somewhere in the middle is where we're going to get the best of both worlds, right? On this side, you might have a lot of conformity and obedience. And on this side, you can have maybe like antisocial or like some psychopathology or a narcissist, right? As an extreme. And then in the middle, we're looking for some kind of a coherent individual group, which is kind of what I'm trying to create with this. And there would be certain skills that we can learn that'll make us very, very strong because we're together as a group, right? Every specific person is making the group stronger in some ways, right? In contrast to if it was just solely on their own, or people that were homogenous and didn't have autonomy, right? Like, yeah. And then on this side, if people are specifically individual, they're going to lack those social bonds that promote mental health and then give us those properties of feedback, right? Feedback is necessary. You need to have other people to do it. You can't just do it on your own, right? That's reflection, So yeah, okay. So this is like a growth kind of a thing here, or an awareness of self. And, we have the character thing we're talking about. And yeah, and then identity, obviously. Okay, so we want to understand this as kind of the territory. Now let's go back to the being, right? So a lot of what I do as like, if we talk about a philosophical methodology, is where do you start from, right? And so if I started here and I went all the way to here, and then I got to like the end, right? I was like, okay, now what do I talk about? And if you don't know, just go back to the start, because usually what will happen is you'll have one train of thought and it'll end up here, and there'll be all these little branches, right? And you can kind of like, they may not be endpoints, but they're points that you could open up and unpack in the future if necessary. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the start, and we're going to branch off from another perspective and see where that leads us, right? So that's kind of my method. I go out, I map the area, like intellectually or conceptually, and then we go back and we see where we're at. And then that way you get like a full rounded understanding of what's going on here with whatever it is. This method, I'm doing that all the time, just as like a methodology thing. Okay, so we've got the being. So the being, so over here, we're just going to say that which exists. So in the present moment, that which exists. I am the thing existing, right? So this is when we talk about Descartes. So we got our philosopher here. And he talks about the cogito. So this is in some ways, how do I know I exist? And he says, I think I am, or I think, therefore I exist. So the fact that you're a thinking being, the external world may not be real, but at least the thinking being is real. And so he derives this dualistic perspective that there's an external world and a mental world. And the difference between the two is extension. Is the things in mind are not out there. The things out there have extension. It's a property he identifies. So we have the cogito. So not that this is one of those points. I'm not going to go any farther. I'm just going to leave it there, right? But just to connect it with the history of philosophy in some ways. And so that which exists, we have the being, right? And we went through this before, like maybe 3 months ago. You guys can check the videos. We started off from a skeptical position. And I was identifying what exists, like what is. And yeah, that's important. It's important to, like, I think it was maybe the first principles discussion. I'm not sure. And yeah, so we have the cart, we have the cogito, that which exists, right? And from this point of existence, we project out this self nature. Okay? And the projected self nature has certain properties. So how do I represent this? Yeah, because we want to represent it as a unit of self. And so the question is, how do we identify a unit of self? Another way to say is, what are the properties of a self? Now, in this instance, self is being defined as the thing that the being is projecting. So right now, I am conveying a certain self. And so I think what we need to do is we need to frame it in first of all. So this would be like the philosophy society self. Right? And then there's going to be certain properties that distinguish this specific self from other selves within this frame. So one would be like, now these are, again, in some ways they're going to be universal. This contextual element, that's going to be very different, almost in every instance. You know, like you guys are also doing a philosophy society self, but it's participating online, right? Or via YouTube or something like that. So that context is a little bit different. I am, talking and stuff like that and writing stuff down. So the philosophy society self, one is going to be emotion. That's one property that you can discriminate oneself from the other. So when we talk about properties, that would mean, how can I discriminate oneself from another? Right? And emotion, right? Now, within this context, so if we have emotion here, there could be like variability in the emotion within the context. But then across context, if we had like, this is philosophy society 1, philosophy society 2, the emotion might be different, right? So this and this are different in some ways, at least by time. You know what I mean? So one is emotion. Another one would be like behaviors. Now, behaviors, if you go back to the PS context, quantifying behaviors is a little different. It wouldn't be like a graph like this. So we can measure this via like intensity, like how intense is the emotion. Like if someone's upset, there could be a spike in the emotion, for example. And then there's going to be the type, right? So they could be happy, they could be sad, they could express disgust. And within the behaviors, there's going to be certain instances and types and categories of behaviors, right? So representing that as a thing in itself. So we're just going to leave it there. That's one of those points where we're going to come back to that, because that's a big unpacking, because it's not a linear model to represent. Because there are different types of behaviors, right? And you could almost do a new self for just like drawing on the board self. And so part of this is it becomes almost like a fractal representation. So what a fractals are is it's on infinity, the pattern keeps on going, right? And so like you can look through these, like they're like, I don't know, toys for kids. You could look through the little thing. It's called a kaleidoscope, and have all these colors and like these little designs and stuff like that. Fractal representations also exist in like people that do DMT, for example, like high doses of DMT. And we can see them in certain areas of nature, like almost in a seashell, when the seashell goes into the spiral, like the not golden spiral, but yeah. Anyways, okay, so the point is that you can keep on breaking apart into smaller units forms of self. And so that almost makes it self-refuting. We could almost say, well, does that mean that it's the ad infinitum just makes it like an indistinguishable property, like it's nothing you can do? And maybe that's the case. Maybe we have to just dispense of this thesis. But I feel that there's a way for us to represent the nature of self with specific properties. And so the difference here is like the periodic table of elements right, is like a chart. Okay, it's a very, chemists would be like, wait. It's a chart and it's static, right? However, the self nature is not. And part of the reason, I think, is because we're going through time. So things are changing in the self-representation just the way that we are, right? Some way to identify some kind of a fractal representation would make it, it would be more representative of the nature of consciousness, right? How we see things and how we experience the world around us. Okay, so we have emotions, behaviors. There's some, like, we have to talk about that, identifying different kinds of behaviors. And this could be like a typology that goes on forever in some ways. That almost might be situational in its own way. It would be another context within, like behavioral context within the situational context, right? So this is situational. And now that I have the situational here, I would have to like identify some other context within it that would be like behavior 1 within the situation. And then you can put another context and call that behavior 2. And they're not mutually exclusive. They can like cross over. You can have like behavior 1 and behavior 2 can be here, right? It doesn't mean, and that's how you can see that it as a complex phenomenon, it is super complicated at this point. It's almost like it becomes like a calculus, you know? I'm not really sure how I would represent that. That's something that I want to figure out, but yeah. So behaviors, emotions. The next one would be like objectivity / like, not subjectivity, but psychosis. So we go back here, the being in the self, this is within the context of the environment, right? The environment has an influence on the self. And so, excuse me, the being can misrepresent its perceptions of its environment. There can be a misattributed self. And so what we would want to do in a therapeutic context, right, would be to maybe teach the person that their form of interpretation is just incorrect. And they want to express a different self model, right? Now, there might be a neurological reason why the person just can't do that. Like if you're colorblind, there's just no way, right? And so there's going to have to be some empirical exploration there to kind of see how this stuff would work out using this model. Because in one sense, maybe they can rely on the perceptions of others. Someone that's colorblind or blind, you can just walk them across the street, right? They can't see themselves, so they have the aid of another person. That's going to be contingent on their sociability property. If they have antisocial tendencies, like trust-mistrust issues, like an Erickson view, then it's going to be very difficult for them to disregard their own perception. So that one movie, A Beautiful Mind, Nash was like a mathematician that talked about game theory. And yeah, at a certain point, he was schizophrenic and he saw like different people in his experience. And at a certain point in the film, at least, he, played by Russell Crowe, he realizes that they're hallucinations because he got older, like 20 or 30 years, and this girl was never aged. She always stayed like maybe 7 years old or 8 years old or something like that, right? And so he realized there's no way this can be real because she's still a kid, right? And now I'm like in my 50s now, like what the hell? So there was some way through reflection and his own intelligence, he was able to discriminate that his perception of the environment was incorrect, right? At least in the film. I'm not sure how representative that is of the true story, but the film showed that. So, okay, unit of self, fractal representation. Just that makes it super tough to represent. But if you can do it, then you'll have greater control because you're already experiencing things like you're living in that as it is anyways. And so all we really want to do is just take our experience and simplify it into some kind of a formula, right? And that formula would utilize these properties of self in a way that you can create new selves formulaic, like mathematically almost, right? But not in the same way that it would be quantitative, you know? Like it would be a qualitative methodology that you have to practice, and the application of, just like in ethics, right? Objective ethics exists. The application of ethics is the problem, right? And that goes back to the virtue ethics thing. Developing practical wisdom is a skill that you develop over time. And so, yeah, philosophers are going to throw intellectual missiles at me for that one, which is fine. And okay, so over here, what we're looking at is how is it the case that we can identify these properties of the self, in some ways, put a boundary around the unit of self, or what we're going to, and it could just be stipulative, you know, that we just determine at an ongoing basis what it is. So it's almost like if you have a video and you take a screenshot, right? If someone asked the question, what is the picture in the video? That question wouldn't make sense, right? Because you could take an infinite amount of pictures, and that could be the same way that the self works, is that there could be an infinite amount of selves. And that's why I talk about it as a fractal representation, because it's an ongoing thing. That's what consciousness is. It's like a stream of awareness in some ways, right? Or information processing, or coherence of all things through some narrative format. And so, yeah, so identifying what the units of self are and then what the properties of the self are is going to be useful, because then you can look at the properties of the self and say, hey, this behavior was a problem, right? Because it led to these consequences. So if you had one specific behavior within here and that led to a negative consequence, you want to be able to go back and modify that behavior from, so you had B1 to B3, and you remove B2, whatever behavior 2 is, right? And yeah, that would be good. And we already do that in some ways. Like it's already kind of happening. Like and that goes back to the error stuff. You make a mistake, like don't do that. You're aware of it, and then you correct it. You do something differently. So if you're like learning to play a sport, you didn't kick the ball. You just like, okay, now I got to learn to make contact with my foot to the ball, and you work on that from there on in. And so experientially, we kind of do this as it is, but I'm trying to say is there's some way we can represent this, and it can't be like really quantitated in the same way that addition or subtraction is as a mathematical enterprise. But it doesn't, even if it's qualitative, it doesn't mean that we can't have some kind of representation. So for example, P to the S equals S to the I. So your project, the way that you project yourself, has an effect on the self. It influences the self, which is, you know, equals might be incorrect as an operator, but we're gonna use it for now, which equals the self's influence on its interpretation or the way that you perceive things, right? I just threw that out there. But I thought about these things when I was reading Sartre many, many years ago. And Sartre talks about consciousness as always of something, right? And so I think that's super important to keep in mind, And there's the thing doing the perceiving, the I, right? The conscious being in the moment. That's the most core of your experience, is just being conscious. You could talk about like perception is even more core. Like maybe you're like not really conscious, but your body's still processing stuff, but you're really not a self in that. Like you're still the being, like someone in a vegetative state, you know, like that's almost a no self, right? They're not really conscious. They're still a being though. It's just that it's like the TV's off. It's not on. You know, every channel is a different self. There is no channel right now. There's a minimum required amount of processing that necessitates selfness. You know what I mean? And that's where the properties. So one of the properties would be like consciousness. So, okay, so the self has an effect on what it's interpreting. So I can have biases, for example, or you can prime me with a color. And then if I'm just in a completely blue room with lights that are beaming blueness in me, and then I go out into another area where there's like a gradient of colors, the first priming of the blue room is going to affect how I perceive color. And so my judgment of things in the second room will be different than someone who comes from a neutral environment and perceives the world in a neutral way, right? Or if they were in a green room, right? Like there's the red after image effect, right? When you put your eye to the light and then you close your eye and you look, then you have this after image going on, right? So there are perceptual things based on our physiology and the way that our brains sense data and then how we perceive that data. That's one thing. But then there's also just like other biases, like obedience and, well, it's not like a bias, but it's like a social influence, or the bystander effect, right? And so that would be a form of self that's affecting how we interpret the world or our environment. But then you also have how you're interpreting stuff having an effect on the self, okay? And so I can rewire my brain to not be as biased. So I am using my interpretation of things to change my self nature. And that's where understanding the properties of the self is useful, because then we can, I think that it gives people greater control. If you want to live a good life, what is the mechanism to do that? Well, I think this is something that would speak to that. This is what it's supposed to, that's where I'm going with it. You know, I don't know how far the trail is, but I'm walking down the trail. You know what I mean? I'm on it. I don't think I'm going to fall down. Some philosophers would say I'm out in space and I'm incorrect, but let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. So yeah, that's where I'm going with this. And so there is some reciprocal relationship between the self's influence on consciousness or interpretation of world or perception and our conscious effect on ourselves. And the selves can kind of change over time, like self 1, self 2, self 3. And so I'm trying to say, like, how do you differentiate between these? Right? And I feel that like one property could be like goal orientation. So the way that you contextualize the self, it's starting here, it ends here, and there's some trajectory that the goal is going towards. And that's one unit of self. Because we don't want the unit of self to be equivalent to the properties of self. That doesn't make sense. That's a category mistake. The properties of the self have to, when all put together, create a unit. So for example, an electron is not an atom. The electron is part of what the atom is. And so if the self is equivalent to the atom, what are the electrons of the self? And so consciousness is kind of one of them. Emotion is another one. Behaviors is another one. I feel that objectivity and psychosis, it kind of has to be one. And then this goal orientation or projection, which is a function of the consciousness, right? That goes back to Sartre saying, consciousness is a projection onto something. When I am conscious of the chair, I become the chair in some ways. There's obviously limitations to that because I'm not really a chair. I am the being. So yeah, so that's kind of like, yeah, that's where we're going with it. What do you guys think? I just threw a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to save my questions for last, but I had an idea to share with you. Okay, so I've never heard anybody talk about the self being separate from consciousness, but it's also something I thought I reached at with my own, with the metaphysics I've been working on myself.
Yeah.
But I also had an idea with the metaphysics that I wanted you to criticize. So
Okay.
if it's a good time, I could ask you the question now, or I could save it for later.
No, ask it now.
Okay. So I was really awesome to hear you validate that the self is like separate from the consciousness. They're affiliated, but kind of separate.
Mhm.
Um, I also had an idea that they might be opposing each other. There might be forces that oppose each other, one subduing the other depending on the environment. What do you think about that? Like, do you need more context to criticize it, or like, can you criticize it like just the question as I framed it?
Yeah, well, like in Buddhism, they talk about the no self kind of approach, that you want to let go of the ego in some ways, right? And you want to kind of become only pure consciousness. And like you can try to approach that to some degree, but you're always going to have like your biological ness as a being. Now, I think that you can get into like a certain dissociative state, and maybe that's what they mean. You know, you get like nirvana or the enlightenment is a persistent dissociative state, maybe. But you know, you're always the being. Like you can't escape that. Like that goes back to Kant, right? Like a perception, I'm always part of my awareness of myself. You know, like myself is always part of my awareness. Like the self and consciousness are distinct, but it is through some form of self that I am conscious.
Understood. But like, could it be also the case that the way I understand it, it's that the self and the consciousness are like two opposing forces, but they work together to kind of give you life. So the way I mean it is, the reason I reached this conclusion is because of, actually because of imperial, like, scientific research. There are cases where not complicated beings like animals, humans, even unicellular organisms, but also like molecular entities, like complicated biological molecular entities. They're not alive, they're not dead, just like viruses, right? They're not alive, they're not dead. But there's a case where they could be in their own niche, an environment where all these entities are gathered together, and when need be, for the, it's not, I wouldn't necessarily call it survival because they're not alive in the first place, but to persist in the state at which they exist in the moment, one organism might denature itself in some way in order to protect the rest of the group from denaturing or not existing in the way that they currently persist in, right?
Mhm.
So that's a form of sacrifice, but in a non-living thing. It's not living, it's just like an entity that works, that is organized in a certain way because of the laws of physics. um
Mhm.
in that case, I would also apply that there is a sense of self there. These beings are coming together. If they evolved a little bit more, they would turn into a cell, and then they evolve a little bit more from there, they would turn into a multicellular organism, right? But at that stage, they also have a low amount of ego and some amount of consciousness, which is opposing the ego, in which case allowed one of the entities to sacrifice itself, despite the self not wanting to be sacrificed, wanting to persist in its state. So I understand it to be a self, to be something that wants to persist in the way it exists currently, and the consciousness being something that can understand the condition and be able to sacrifice itself for something greater than just the ego.
Mhm.
um yeah, so what do you think about that in non-living things as well?
Yeah, I would just say that like you're just talking about systems, that there are self-sustaining systems in nature and in biology, right? Like certain proteins like DNA have like very complicated mechanisms. And when you look at the models of these proteins and how they interact with each other, like how DNA is replicated, it's like super, it's like, wow, like I can't, and how really complicated one protein is, like how big it is. It's not just like two things together, it's huge. And you know, like that's just, but it's not conscious and it's not a self, it's a system, right? It's a lower ordered existing entity that is not conscious, it's not aware, there's no awareness, it's not through a process of ofing, it's not of something, like when it's not perceiving things, there's no interpretation, it just is. It like, and that's the basis of our biology and of nature to some degree. You know, like we live in a interactive environment where all the parts are interacting with each other, some more so than others. Some things are relatively inert, like there's no explosion when I go like this. But if you did this to some things, it would explode. It would just be like, you know, I would just say it's a misattribution to say that all systems that have a like self-sustaining mechanism are necessarily selves, or that they're conscious. I would say that, you know, they're interesting, they exist, they're complicated, but they're not aware. You know, some people try to say that everything is conscious, that rocks and trees are conscious, but that's an equivocation. So when we bring in our critical thinking tools, right? So one of our fallacies is equivocation. And that is when you use the same word for two different meanings. And again, we determine meaning by the use of the word, right? And so it's better, like, to avoid that, you look at the use, and if your use is so different from over here, like saying that the table is conscious, and you compare the table to like a dog, right? They're super different. The table doesn't have autonomy. The table can't do things on its own. It can't move. There's no central nervous system. There's no biology in the table. Like, it's made of wood, maybe you could say that there's something going on there, but it's not in the same way that animals or organisms are, you know, not the tree that it came from. And even the tree, to say that the tree is conscious, again, what do you mean by consciousness here? You know, there is no central nervous system. And that's a big deal when it comes to, it's a big threshold when it comes to what we mean by consciousness when we say it. When we point at things and we're categorizing stuff, like the tree can have some, like, you could almost say sensory awareness, maybe, you know, like my psychologist or biologist friends would have to come and communicate about this a little bit. But like the tree, I think it's better that it detects stuff chemically and then reacts, you know, but it's not making decisions. There's no executive function. There's no frontal lobe, you know, like I think it would be really interesting if we could see some non-Earth being that is like super complicated. It's not a single cell organism and has a completely different means of intelligence than us. Like, for example, if there was like a planet or a series of planets that were close to each other, or maybe a bunch of asteroids that put matter in between them, and there was a lot of resources on the planet, and so this thing just grew to the point where it could like travel from planet to planet. And in this solar system, it just got really good traveling all over the place to the point where it could go out of the solar system. And it was just like this mass of a blob or something like that. Like, who knows, right? I'm just making shit up. But I'm just saying that like that kind of a thing, if it had some, like, what is awareness for that? Like, because it could just be like, there's organic matter light years across of organic matter, like a lot of it. In the cosmos, but it's not conscious in the same way that we are. Like, we're primates. We come from apes. So our all the environments we create are based on like sheltering us. They're not made in and of themselves. They're human made. Like, the wall is vertical. Why? Because I'm like a biped. So it's easy for me, and the board is like almost perfectly at eye level. Like, I can reach the top and I can reach the bottom. You know what I mean? So it's like our entire civilization is built for us. It's not built for octopuses, you know? And so there are other organisms like octopuses or dolphins or elephants, you know, chimpanzees that demonstrate high intelligence, or which is another way to say that they have a sophisticated degree of consciousness. But like, are they aware? Are they aware? Like, they're not using language. Like, another big barrier is language, right? Like, and from language, then you have ethics. Like, are they making moral decisions based on concepts? That's not happening, right? And so that distinguishes humans. So it would be cool to see some kind of a blob that has concepts. You know, is that a thing? Right?
I understand. But let me be a little bit more daring here, and let me
Sure.
ask you: Is it too preposterous to suggest that we are just as unconscious as everything else, and that let's say just the same way that the chemical conditions that allow systems of complicated molecules to exist and to persist, is that the same reason that we exist and persist in our current state? Is that the reason we want to be alive? Do we really want? Can we really want? That's the question, right? Because ever since we were born, before we were able to think of anything, we've always wanted to be alive. If a baby starves, it cries.
Yeah.
If a baby's in danger, it cries for its mother, right? It's not that anybody taught it to cry. It's built in that if it cries, it survived. Enough babies in our history, the ones who didn't cry died, and the ones who cried lived, right? So aren't we just the results of the same operation, the results of the same laws of physics that brings about persistent molecules that exist in order? Aren't we the same things that arise from order? So wouldn't that make us equal? We're all as unconscious as each other, and we are all as much of a result as a system, that as a rock or a planet circling around a sun, or a galaxy circling around other galaxies.
Well, like, just with the property of self-awareness, right? And not only self-awareness, but the ability to have coherent linguistic symbols that represent that which we're aware of, right? That in itself distinguishes humans from self-sustaining systems that don't have like a nervous system. Like, they're not, like, you can detect awareness without us even communicating it, right? Like, you can have like a light and then we look at it, or like the red dot experiment where they take like chimps and they put like a red dot and they can kind of see that it's there, you know? So like, and there are certain organisms that just can't determine that, you know? So yeah, I think that we, like, to say that how are we not as unconscious as everything else? I think that like if you're judging it based on like a fictional understanding of what God is, right? Like, if you're saying, well, if you're not omniscient, then you're nothing, right? And so if omniscience is like an infinite amount of awareness, and then there's like us and everything else, well, obviously that scope is like, you can't compare to that. You can't be all-knowing. And that's not what we're judging it against. Like, when you judge it like this, God, omniscience, and then everything else, well, obviously there's a huge gap, but we're looking down here, right? And we're saying that human beings have evolved to a point and created a society and a civilization that facilitate our existence in a certain way. And the reason we have the capacity to do that is because we're conscious, right? Whereas other forms of matter don't have that. Like, they're not, like a virus is not aware, you know? A virus is just like almost like a protein. It's just doing stuff and it doesn't care what it does. It's just part of its programming, right? And when I say programming, I don't mean it was intentionally programmed that way. It was just like haphazard. It's just, that's the way it was put together at a chemical level. And then there's certain chemical reactions that make movement, and all of these little movements makes like a mechanism, right? Yeah. And that's it. That is so like that mechanistic, like property of nature is like embedded in us, right? That's like how our brains work and how our cells work. Like there'll be a cell membrane, and then if there's like, depending on the degree of sodium, the membrane will open up and it will allow more sodium in or excrete it out, right? And it'll depolarize, and that's how our neurons fire. And so, and then there's other forms of cell membrane changing that has other functions within the body, just as how humans function. And so, yeah, like consciousness is, it's a form of like, it is like the base level of awareness, and awareness could be like on a spectrum. Because when you're sleeping, it's still you're still alive and you exist, but people use consciousness in an ambiguous way too, because they say you get knocked unconscious, but you're still like alive, right? So I think that awareness and consciousness are pretty tied together, like the way that when we look at the use of the word, like when I use the word, but consciousness is like a process. It's like, and then there's like your consciousness, like that, like you talking, like your narrative, like you talking to yourself. And so the process, when we isolate the definition, we talk about the process, right? Like the mouse I use for the Chromebook here, it has like, you could say it has physical processes, like gravity is interacting with it. It's pretty stable. I think that it is deteriorating, like plastic does deteriorate over time. And that's a process, right? But it doesn't mean that it's conscious. Process and consciousness are not equivalent,
Yeah,
that,
that's kind of an interesting answer, but also have an interesting question to counteract that.
Sure.
If a person was born blind, deaf, and also with no paralyzed, all right, blind, deaf, and paralyzed, which basically hits the criteria for almost no perception of the outside world, is that person internally conscious?
Yeah, I think it would severely limit their capacity for consciousness, right? Like, like feral children, kids that are like isolated and don't socialize, they eventually can't use language in the same way that someone has social interaction does, right? So a being that doesn't develop properly is going to be pretty depreciated in their capacity for consciousness. There has to be something going in the processor, right? The brain is like the seat of consciousness. And so if the brain's depreciated, then there's nothing to be conscious in. There's nothing, there's no faucet for the water to flow. If you don't have a faucet, well, then there's no consciousness really. And so I think it depends on how we define consciousness. Like you could have a broader definition that would still include that, but usually in our daily, like, yeah, like they might have embodiment, like maybe they can feel sensations. Like there's other, like if you just say removing all sensory perception, are you still conscious? I would say, well, probably not, like you're basically in a vegetative state, right?
Yeah. And yeah, it's like the brain computes, but it computes input, right? And that's what we call basically consciousness. And I think you used an example of text there, right? We reproduce text, we create text, right? We create art, we create, a bunch of things in the environment that we can interpret as meaning something, right? And we can universally, at least a group of people can understand each other when it comes to the text and agree on what it means. So that's what we call the text, and only we can reproduce it. But like, I don't think that's the case, right? Like just in nature, for example, there can be naturalized texts. So that's what I call them, naturalized texts. What naturalized texts are is they're not artificial. Right? For example, in Africa, I don't know if it's the same case here, but there are some insects that are very colorful, very, very colorful, right? And dogs will stay away. They will not eat those insects. I will not eat or like try to get near those insects, right? Why? Those insects are most of the time telling us that they are poisonous, right? Same thing with plants, right? They would have very colorful things, or they will have a certain smell about them, right? And anybody that can detect them and that does not have immunity from their poison will stay away until it evolves the ability to eat them or something like that, right?
Sure.
So that's basically a biological text, right, from a creature that we consider unconscious, right? So that's the case here. Where, like, in the metaphysics, I say there's something called naturalized consciousness and the other type of consciousness, right? Which I don't have a name for yet. But in naturalized consciousness, it's like there is no visible entity that is conscious, but they have patterns of actions, over generations or collectively as a group, that makes it look as if they're intelligent or conscious, right? When you look at it, an individual ant is just dumb, like running around in circles, confused, and then eventually will die in a few hours, right? But then if you collectively view them as a group, you can find ant colonies. There's an ant colony in Europe that stretches from Spain all the way to France, I think, or further, right? It's huge mega structures they create, right? And that's something we expect something intelligent or conscious to build. Whereas this is just basically incredibly dumb creatures that communicate chemically, building it collectively for some unknown reason, right? They just evolved the ability to do it, and they just
Yeah.
did it.
Okay, one sec. Let's just pause here, and then I'm gonna respond. So when you say that it's a text, right? You're begging the question, which is a critical thinking fallacy, because you're imposing intentionality, right, in the color of the bug. But what's really happened is it's just evolved. It's evolved that some that show that color, they're less eaten, and so they reproduce more, and then they become more vibrant in the color, or the plant with the smell. Do you see my evolutionary point here? And then begging the question means that in the premise of your argument, you're using the conclusion and the premise as basically the same premise, right? So it's like saying the Bible is true because the Bible says that it's true. It's a circular argument, right? I need to have an external reference to make that one premise true. I can't use the same premise in the conclusion. And so for you to say that the bug is intelligent because it is colored, and it's colored because it's intelligent, that doesn't work. You have to have a different reason. And the reason is it's evolution, actually. It's not that there is some intelligence there, you could say. Again, how do we define intelligence here? It has the ability to detect stuff and process stuff, and has complex behaviors, and coordinate with other members of its own species and whatever, deal with threats and whatnot. But I think it's problem solving skills. That's a good measure of intelligence. And yeah, and so, I think another way, instead of saying text, you could say that there are signals. There's something that signifies, like, if the ground is wet, that can signify to me that it's a trip hazard, or it's a fall hazard, sorry, right? Doesn't mean that the ground has consciousness and it's like speaking to me through its wetness. It's just wet. And then I'm the one that's conscious because I interpret it. I'm like, we've seen somebody die a very horrible death eating that bug, and we're not going to do that anymore, right?
Yes. Like, usually the way I classify it, because like metaphysics is about like classifying the most basic stuff, right? Like it's part of metaphysics, right? The way I classify things that don't look conscious or have some level of order, but you cannot classify them as, like, something conscious. It's because they're part of a bigger ordered system. Because they're part of you're not zoomed out far enough to see the entity, right? You're just like, if you see a human being and you just see the arm, you're just like seeing something that's moving, like, it's a weird example, but yeah.
No, it's fine.
If you
Like,
zoom out, if you zoom out further enough, you can see the purpose the arm serves. You can start predicting in which directions the arm will move depending on the situation. Is it trying to grab something? Does it want to eat? Right? Something like that. If you see
sure,
like
but
a sign on the ground
Mhm.
that says wet, caution, wet, you just see an object, right? But if you zoom out further enough, you see like the shop it's in, right? And then you can start predicting where that sign will be next, right? Location wise, and you will start to see an ordered system.
yeah, but that's okay. So as soon as you go down that road, if you make it a deductive argument, it's invalid. So you have to make it an inductive argument, and that means that there's a possibility that it's the case, right? Like the 5 blind men and the elephant, you know, they all are touching one different part. They think it's a different thing, and it's an elephant. And so you might see like a little space, and you're like, oh, this is the ant colony. That's all it is. But you need to zoom out and see the whole network that spans many kilometers. Sure, but you still have to prove that. You can't, you know, go from a particular instance and make a general conclusion. And that's what you'd be doing, right? And so you can't make implications on a general consciousness. You have to observe that general consciousness first and prove its existence. And then you can make claims about particular instances of that general consciousness.
Well, what
Right.
does what does Dimitri think? I'm thinking Dimitri has been, you know, thinking a lot. I want to see his critique on this.
Sorry, I was distracted there for a second.
So basically, the whole thing is that we're talking about we're synthesizing the idea of are we all as unconscious as each other? Like, are we as unconscious as an ant, or maybe as unconscious as a piece of rock? Are we all just a result of a natural occurrence that is universal to everything, and nothing is an exception? It's just more complicated than the other.
I believe in a universal consciousness between all living beings. Anything that is alive, basically, and has like biochemical processes, like plants, for example, animals, anything that's alive has, like, I believe, a certain level of consciousness, and then humans are capable of reaching higher states of consciousness. Because there was this one study where plants technically they're kind of telepathic with each other, like they communicate with each other through either vibrations or through the air, which is weird. I'll link the study if you want. But yeah, I believe that there's like a unified consciousness, and then like as humans we share like higher states of consciousness. Like we have the capacity to achieve those states either through like fasting or meditation or maybe through like psychedelics. There's different ways in reaching those states that not other animals can perceive, in my opinion.
Do you think we have a soul that's kind of makes us different a little bit, that helps us achieve higher levels? Do you think we have a soul, or are we just the same?
To be honest, I do believe that we have a soul because energy does not create nor destroy itself. And like, I'm a little bit religious, so like, I'm assuming my view also stems from there a little bit about having a soul. Or like, I'm now something I've been pondering about is if the soul and consciousness are connected. Like, is our soul the consciousness? Is consciousness the soul? That's one thing I haven't really come to a conclusion yet, if it's separate or one entity.
So I think like Dimitri has like the opposite view. He thinks most things are conscious, whereas I'm saying like everything is unconscious. And he in his opinion we also have souls. What about you, sir? What do you think about souls? Like, do you think we have a soul, or do you have like an interpretation of the soul that Hegel has?
Like the Geist? Well, I think there's something to be said about some Geistness as a collective unconscious, like just like as society develops and stuff like that. But the soul, in some ways, doesn't make sense because, you know, when you define the soul as the essence of a person, but someone gets prefrontal cortex damage, their essence changes. So the soul is supposed to be something that's unchangeable, but we have evidence of people changing through physical damage. And so even Alzheimer's or dementia, right? Or people that suffer strokes, you know? And so, yeah, like if soul and consciousness were the same, when you get knocked unconscious, you would get like knocked unsoulness, right? Which we would say that doesn't make sense. That's not what we think of as a soul. You think of a soul as like a spirit, like if you just like the ghost of Achilles, you know? And nothing can change the ghost of Achilles. but the body can get hurt. So if I get like bleh, hit, like my soul space would still stay there, you know. But that's not. I don't know.
So what you're implying is that like if the soul were to exist, in your opinion, that means that it would be the same as consciousness?
I'm saying that you said that, right? And I'm saying the problem with that would be
No, I
that
didn't say it's the same. I mean, I haven't come to a conclusion if it's the same or not, but if you're stating that, let's say you get prefrontal cortex damage,
Mhm.
I believe your consciousness will change, but not your soul, because I feel like it's like your life force. It doesn't really necessarily have to do with your thoughts, like your processes, your mental processes, which is, I believe, different.
the people would say like you have a good soul, you know, like they would say that like Charles Manson has a bad soul, like he's not a good guy, right? Like, or Hannibal Lecter is a bad guy,
Was
you
that the
know.
Satan? Was that the Satanist?
Is it maybe? Yeah, he was like
Actually,
a
I'm thinking it was
killed a bunch of
called
people at a
Crowley.
cult. It's a cannibal, or like, you know, like Hitler had a bad soul, you know. And so to attribute like moral conduct to this essence, your moral conduct is something that is determined by parts of your brain. And to say that it's an essence means that it's unchanging. But when we look at the evidence, there is no unchanging part of the self. That's why Buddhism is more accurate, that there is no self in the sense that a static thing that never changes. There is a changing dynamic self, and that's why I talked about the fractalism hypothesis.
Hmm. The thing is, everything, like we live in a fractal universe. Everything is basically fractal based.
No, there exists some fractalness in the universe, but like the images behind me are not fractal in nature, right?
Oh, I meant like the structure of the universe. I remember reading that
Yeah.
somewhere. How like we're in a fractal universe.
Here, I'll show you guys. This is like fractal represent. That's why I said like seashell is kind of fractal. It goes on in infinity, right? Like some people that do DMT, they see these things. It's just the same pattern repeated infinitely. Some of the stuff is not fractalism, but whatever. Maybe if you zoom in, it would be. But yeah,
What if you like zoom out enough
if you
from
zoom out enough,
from like from the universe? I mean, we don't really know that, but
yeah. Well, I don't know. It's yeah.
because like you know our neural networks, for example, like are very closely linked to like how the universe or like all the universes connect, and like how our lungs like are very similar to like the branches and the roots of trees and plants.
Yeah, there's similar patterns, but they're not fractal in the sense of that infinity and then direct pattern copying, right? They are a little different.
Gotcha.
Okay, I'm tired now. I think we've got to the end of my cognitive because I did not sleep last night. I had a couple naps today, but I juiced out as much as you guys are getting out of me for today.
It was still good. I appreciate your time and
Yeah.
talk.
So next week, we're gonna continue with the 7 Habits. I encourage you guys to read it. We're gonna begin with the end in mind. I'm gonna have slides again and go through it. Maybe I'll talk about some of this stuff a little bit more. I made some intellectual progress for myself, so I'm happy with that. All right, guys, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having us.